Yes, I listened to Revolver 4 times in one day.
Giant orange
A tale of four revolvers. 3-4, cough, cough. This is a tale of not one, two, or three, but rather four revolvers. That's right, somehow I wound up with 4 copies of this marvelous album by the Beatles. Some say it's the greatest rock album of all time, some say it's the Beatles' best album. I've given up on choosing favorite albums or favorite Beatles albums, but there's no question that the Beatles were on fire in 1966, which was a majorly creative time for the band. They were always curious, trying new things, taking chances, and being artists. On this album, they got to explore the recording studio and use it as its own instrument. They had the genius of George Martin as a producer, and recording engineer Jeff Emmerich was young and willing to try new ideas, and with the permission of Martin, they broke many of the rules set out by the powers that be, who are still wearing stuffy lab coats in the EMI studio. Thankfully, Martin and Emmerich were able to pull off some amazing feats for the Beatles. Revolver stands out for many reasons, and it's definitely the peak of their creative middle years albums. It's one of those albums that I've heard so many times, I almost forget to really pay attention to the details when I listen. Not too long ago, my son and I sat on the sofa and listened to the album start to finish. It was really fun and reinvigorating to introduce this record to him for the first time. He picked it out himself. So, as with a wildly popular international group, there are different versions of these albums. 2 of these are the American Capitol Records versions with 11 tracks, and 2 of these are the British Parlophone versions with all 14 tracks, the way the Beatles themselves intended for it to be presented. This is a Scranton press from 1966 with the Capitol Rainbow label, and I've had this one the longest. I got it at the Great Escape in Tennessee, and it's been so long that I got it maybe 20 years. I can't remember what the record store looked like. It cost me $3. This next one is a Winchester pressing on the Apple label, and it is from 1971. I got this at Papa Jazz Records in Columbia, South Carolina. I don't think I paid more than $5 for it. Both of these are in VG condition with some light scratches here and there, but gosh, these things sound way, way better than they look. A lot of people like to knock the Capitol Records versions, but I think these sound pretty fantastic. You can't mess up good songs like these, unless of course you leave off 3 tracks like I'm Only Sleeping and Your Bird Can Sing and Dr. Robert. This version of the album clocks in at a measly 28 minutes, while the UK version is still only 35 minutes of British rock and roll brilliance. I grew up on the 1988 CD edition of Revolver, which restores it to the original UK running order. Some friends who are a little older than me said up until 1988 almost nobody in America heard the Beatles albums in this running order, and many of these friends still prefer the US versions because that's what they heard first. And this is a 1978 UK pressing on Parlophone from the blue box set stereo. So in 2022, Giles Martin and Sam O'Kell, perhaps Giles Martin's the 6th Beatle, they put out a beautiful stereo mix with today's technology, and it's just so well done. All 4 of these editions are stereo pressings, and I'm hoping to one day find a mono Parlophone pressing. Although the Giles Martin 2022 stereo mix has almost put out that fire because it sounds so good. In fact, all 4 of these editions sound really good sonically, but if we put on our headphones, we can hear that the 2022 mix doesn't hard pan all the instruments to left and right the way the 60s stereo mixes do. And that's simply due to the limitations of the stereo technology of the time. Still, the Beatles wanted these mixes to be in mono and spent a great deal of time in the mixing sessions for the first time during Revolver. I remember hearing a Paul McCartney interview where he said he was at a crowded party listening to Revolver shortly after it came out. They're standing by one of the stereo speakers, and he was telling someone about this great part that was coming up in the song, and it never happened because he was on the wrong end of the stereo mix. Even listening to these albums back to back, yes, I listened to Revolver 4 times in one day. It's hard to tell what the differences are if you're not wearing headphones. And for me, it's best to just enjoy the music. I also prefer listening to speakers over headphones. And at this point in time, the Beatles were using the recording studio as more of an instrument. I said that earlier, but they really made a big deal out of this. They were also frustrated with their live performances because they never played any of these songs live. Revolver was released on August 5th, 1966. The Beatles did their final tours in July and August of 1966. Tomorrow Never Knows is the biggest one-chord mind trip of 1966, and it was the first song recorded for Revolver. It was a quantum leap forward in spirit and sound, and it showed what was possible in the studio with tape loops and guitars and pianos played backwards, forwards, sped up, slowed down. There was a Leslie speaker on John Lennon's lead vocal to make him sound, in his own words, like he was the Dalai Lama singing from a mountaintop. The Leslie vocal starts about halfway through the song with the lyric, "Love is all, love is everyone, it is knowing." The song title is one of those famous Ringoisms, a funny thing that Ringo said that John and Paul often used in their song titles. Other examples of Ringoisms are, "It's been a hard day, day is night," and "We work 8 days a week." The drums on this song were recorded with a close mic technique. There was also a woolen jumper or sweater that was stuffed into the kick drum to deaden the sound. The mics were put closer than EMI would have allowed, but the young recording engineer Jeff Emmerich broke those rules without anyone knowing about it until years later. The drums had to be heavily compressed and limited with a Fairchild 660, pretty cool piece of recording equipment they had at Abbey Road. And this was a breakthrough in recording techniques at the time, and this particular drum sound was used throughout Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. Taxman is the only George Harrison song that ever started off a Beatles record. The Beatles usually put their strongest songs first on their albums, and this just proves how far Harrison had come along in his songwriting. It's a cool guitar riff that always reminds me of the Count Five's Psychotic Reaction, which was released in June of 1966, a full 2 months before Revolver. It's a heavy blues rock riff, and the lead guitar solo on Taxman was actually played by Paul McCartney, and then they copied that lead riff and pasted it onto the end of the song, using tape machines, of course, because not even McCartney could play that riff twice. It's easily one of McCartney's coolest bits of guitar playing on any Beatles record. And evidently Harrison had a hard time playing it and had to concede to let Paul play it. It's a biting protest song that I think almost anyone can relate to. Love You Too is George's first full-on Indian-flavored track for the Beatles. Again, the studio's put to great use with George singing and playing acoustic guitar, with Paul on backing vocals for the first take, and later on an Indian drum called a tabla, and then the electric bass and the fuzz guitar were overdubbed in a separate take. Dr. Robert was a song dedicated to a New York doctor who hooked up celebrities with prescriptions to hallucinogenic drugs. Who would have thought? I guess that was a 60s thing. Apparently, Dr. Robert got busted by the cops later on, and maybe the Beatles gave him too much attention. The harmonium is also a rather unusual rock and roll instrument on this track that was played by John in an overdub. I'm Only Sleeping is one of those lazy John Lennon songs that might have foreshadowed his famous Toronto bed-in a few years later. This is a song that I can relate to, as I'm not much of a morning person and I generally like to sleep in on weekends. It may also be one of the only rock songs to feature a prominent yawn. And on the technical side, using some major studio trickery, the music on this song was slowed down to give it a more lazy feel, while John's vocals were sped up. How they did that, I'm not sure, but they made it work. Eleanor Rigby is one of Paul's classic character songs, and perhaps his most detailed set of lyrics. The violins and cellos on the song were influenced by the staccato style of the soundtrack for the movie Fahrenheit 451, based on the Ray Bradbury book. The movie had just come out at the time. Emmerich also close-mic'd the stringed instruments and said the session musicians were in shock and horror because the microphones were usually 6 feet away rather than 6 inches away from the instruments. It's one of the Beatles' most endearing songs, and it's a rather melancholy number that has held up well through the years. Paul's ballad, For No One, is one of the coolest walkdowns in rock history. The backing track was Paul on piano and Ringo on drums. The song also features a clavichord played by Paul, and it's one of those rare classic rock songs with a French horn in it. The song really captures the feeling of alienation one can feel when they're growing apart from their partner. Got to Get You Into My Life is one of the most soulful and upbeat Beatles tunes, and again shows us the creative streak the band and Paul were on at the time. The Beatles used horn players from Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames Band, along with a handful of session musicians. There were 2 tenor saxes and 3 trumpets featured on this song. McCartney played the notes on the piano for the session players to give them the jazzy feel he wanted, and then they played the parts on the horns. Sometime around the session for this song, in May 1966, is when Paul met Linda, his future wife, at a club where Georgie, Fame, and the Blue Flames were playing. The Beatles wanted more of a Motown sound, and they really wanted the bass guitar to be louder and punchier on this record. Yellow Submarine can be a divisive song, but I'm in the camp that loves it because my son loves it and learned to sing all the words when he was 6. I see it as a goofy children's song that can be read on another level, perhaps as a clever reference for whatever people did in the 60s, though you may have to use your imagination to make those connections. And hey, Ringo needed a song to sing for the album, and this fit the bill. I also really like the goofy sound effects, and I think of images from the cartoon movie Yellow Submarine often when I listen to this song. One of the craziest sound effects made with items pulled from the EMI Cupboard of Oddities was a metal bathtub that was filled with water, and studio staff swished metal chains around in the tub. Full steam ahead! I Want to Tell You is one of Harrison's 3 songs on this album, and that's his strongest showing on any Beatles album up to this point. At first, it doesn't seem as remarkable as his other 2 songs on Revolver, and maybe has more of a Rubber Soul or Help type feel to it, but the lyrics about saying things that your mind doesn't really mean are pretty heady, and I dig that. It's also noteworthy that the Beatles tended to spend less studio time working out the details of Harrison's songs, as they just seemed to want to get them finished quickly. Good Day Sunshine is one of the happiest Beatles songs, and I used to think it was kind of cheesy, but I really dig its optimism these days. The backing track was done in 1 take, but there were several overdubs done to the song. The complexity of the vocals at the end of the song may have inspired the end of the Kinks' Waterloo Sunset. If you listen closely to the end of Good Day Sunshine, you can also hear some tape edits in the final few seconds when some of the overdubs were dropped in. Here, There, and Everywhere is supposedly McCartney's favorite Beatles song that he wrote. It is easily one of the most beautiful Beatles songs, largely due to the block harmonies sang by Paul, John, and George Harrison. The harmonies were arranged by none other than producer George Martin. One recording method the Beatles started using on Revolver was to track the bass guitar as an overdub onto a separate track. This gave the bass more oomph and more punch. Emmerich also used a speaker as a transducence microphone. So what he did was put a speaker in front of the bass guitar amp speaker cabinet to get a bigger sound. Sounds crazy, right? But that's what they did. And John Lennon had been asking why the bass sound on Beatles records wasn't as prominent as the bass was on Wilson Pickett records. So they were trying to figure all that out. She Said was another Beatles song about drugs, maybe, and it was coded in cryptic lyrics. I know what it's like to be dead. She's making me feel like I've never been born. I'd say I could interpret those lyrics as being put down by a woman, maybe, but everyone has their own lens for looking at art. This was the newest and final song to be recorded for Revolver, and it was rehearsed in the studio over about 25 different takes. And Your Bird Can Sing is the guitar workout companion piece to She Said in my ears. This one is very jangly and Birds-like and is a good example of that overly compressed electric guitar sound of the mid-1960s. McCartney and Harrison played the harmonized lead guitar parts. The Beatles also used quite a bit of new equipment on Revolver, including some Fender Showman amps, one with a 15-inch speaker in the cabinet and the other with two 12-inch speakers. By this time, McCartney was using his Rickenbacker bass, a solid body instrument that had far more sustain than his hollow body violin Hofner bass. The Rickenbacker also helped the Beatles achieve more of a Motown sound. Harrison mostly played a 1964 Gibson SG on the album, and Harrison and Lennon had recently acquired Epiphone Casinos, hollow body guitars with P90 pickups. McCartney had already had a Casino for some time, and his was a few years older. Harrison and McCartney had Bigsby vibratos on their Casinos. The story of Revolver is not that there are different pressings in different countries, though this does in fact affect the audience's ability to see the level of growth the band went through. We also need to decide as listeners which copy we enjoy listening to the best. If they all sound the same, I'll go for the most aesthetically pleasing label, which is the Parlophone black and yellow label from the 2022 remastered version. Once upon a time, the American Capitol pressings were pretty affordable, but that was 20 years ago. I would say in mid-2023, the newly remixed version is probably the most affordable and the best sounding version that is readily available. Most record stores should probably still have several copies of this for you to buy. The real story of Revolver is that it's a giant step between Rubber Soul and Sgt. Pepper in the continual musical evolution of the Beatles. It's the Beatles pushing their own boundaries as much as they could at the time, thinking that perhaps they would still play some of this material live. The first major conflict the Beatles faced during Revolver is that they were playing mostly oldies but goodies in their live set at the time, but nobody was able to hear the music anyway due to the sheer volume of screaming girls drowning out the limited amplification equipment available for stadium shows in 1966, because no musicians had ever performed to such massive audiences before. The second major conflict the Beatles faced during Revolver was to get their subjective and experimental ideas translated into reality within the limitations of the studio recording equipment available in England in 1966. But where there's a will, there's a way. And the producer and the engineers made a genuine effort to capture those ideas as reasonably as they could, and that was often good enough to satisfy the creative needs of the Beatles at the time.